Good morning, folks. Welcome to our latest installment of our Public Benefits Are Key training. This is the Seattle-King County Coalition on Homelessness. If you're not super familiar with us, we do a lot of policy and advocacy work, both at the very local level, King County and all the jurisdictions within it, at the state, sometimes at the federal level. We think it's really important that folks have a really solid understanding about what are the benefit programs that people might be entitled and eligible to that are going to help, sort of fight against poverty, help improve housing stability, get them, cash benefits, medical benefits, food benefits, all that stuff. So today, we are really lucky to have Hannah Rosenberger from Solid Ground's Benefits Legal Assistance Program and Huy Nguyen from Benefits Law Center to talk about a little bit of a deeper dive about ABD and SSI, SSDI, and sort of what that transition from the state program looks like into the federal benefits. This is not going to be a 101 conversation. This is really a little bit of a deeper dive for folks that know the basics of the program and eligibility. We're going to start with Hannah, who actually has to hop off at a very hard stop right about at 10 to go support a client in this realm. So we are, this is real-time benefits happening, and how lawyers like Hannah and her team and Huy and his team can support folks in the legal side of getting the benefits that they deserve. You are able to change your name. You can add pronouns, you can add agencies. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. This meeting is being recorded. We will have a blog and we'll have it posted on our YouTube and up on our blog with a sort of a summary and slides, which hopefully you all should have gotten ahead of time in the reminder email. If you want to stay off of the recording, just stay on mute. Throw your questions, comments into the chat. I will be monitoring that. If you are okay being included in the recording, go ahead and just, raise your Zoom hand and we'll call on you. For Hannah's section, and for those of you that have been in a lot of these trainings with us before, we typically do a section questions, because Hannah has a hard stop and we want to make sure we get through all of the information. We're going to go through that information and then leave a little bit of bigger chunk of time at the end for questions. So I'm going to throw in to the chat a link to our post training survey, because we really do appreciate that information. It helps us devise future trainings. It helps make us, improve these ones that we do on repeat. It's also helpful information for us trying to be able to get resources to keep providing and doing more trainings. So I'll throw that in periodically. And then the other couple things I just want to mention before I hand it over to Hannah is on July 12th, so a mere 2 weeks away, we are going to be offering another installment of our Medicare, Medicaid training. So I'm going to throw that link in there. And I will put, once I've handed it over, I'll put some more context in here for folks. And then also on August 1st, we're going to be doing our McKinney-Vento training, which is helping students experiencing homelessness. So if you work with families or students experiencing homelessness, this goes over the federal law and the rights and the funding that it offers for folks. So I will throw some of those links in for folks with a little more context, and I'll probably throw them in periodically. So on that note, Hannah, I will hand it to you. Actually, why don't you introduce yourself? Huy, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into Hannah. So Hannah, and then Huy, and then we'll start in the content.
Great. Thanks so much, Jody. I'm Hannah Rosenberger. I'm the program manager and also one of the benefits attorneys with the Benefits Legal Assistance Program at Solid Ground. So we're a civil legal aid law firm that's part of Solid Ground. We do public benefits, state public benefits, and we work with individuals and families, low-income individuals and families in and around King County.
Hey everyone, my name is Hui Wen. I'm the Executive Director of Benefits Law Center. We've been around since 1997. We were formerly Seattle Community Law Center, and we work with individuals who are homeless and or experiencing disabilities to help them navigate the Social Security system. We are focused here in King County, and we work with a lot of cases regarding eligibility, denial of eligibility, and also post-eligibility issues such as overpayments, terminations, and reductions of their benefits.
I couldn't find the unmute button for a second. Sorry, everybody. Okay. Can folks see my screen? Am I sharing my screen?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
You're looking
Thank
good.
you, everyone. It's always a little trippy when you're doing these online presentations. So I'm staring at my screen. I'm not actually looking at your wonderful faces. So I'm going to kick us off by talking about one of us, what you're all here to at least talk about in part is the Age Blind and Disabled program. So again, I'm Hannah Rosenberger, Program Manager with Benefits Legal Assistance. Jody already mentioned this, but we have a whole section at the end for questions. So feel free to put questions in the chat though as they come up. I have other members of my team on the call, our other attorneys and social worker. So if I run out of time to be here to answer questions, the rest of my team will be able to hop on. So before we get into the meat of the program, I wanted to plug our Ask a Lawyer program. Because you all are here attending this training today, you have access to this additional technical assistance option. We call it our Ask a Lawyer program. So if you have a question about anything we've talked about today, or maybe you meet a client tomorrow and you wonder, maybe are they eligible for ABD? Or maybe you met a client who was just terminated from ABD and you just have you're not sure how to help or what can be done. You can email questions or real life scenarios to benefitslegalhelp@solid-ground.org. And if you put Ask a Lawyer in the subject line, one of our public benefit attorneys will respond. And so the idea with the Ask a Lawyer program is if we can give some advice or help early on to hopefully avoid a legal issue coming up where your client would need an attorney, that's our goal, to try to support you all doing your work so people can keep and get these benefits. I do have referral information for our program, which it's on our last slide. So there's a couple different ways to get connected with us. All right, so I mentioned that we're talking about mostly ABD today, but I wanted to address just briefly one of the other state disability programs, which often goes hand in hand in ABD. So if you're familiar with ABD, you've probably heard of the Housing and Essential Needs Program, or HEN. And what HEN is, it is stands for Housing and Essential Needs. It's a referral program that provides essential needs items. So things like bus passes, hygiene packs, toothbrushes, those kind of essential needs, in addition to potential rental assistance for low-income adults who are unable to work for at least 90 days due to a physical or mental disability or are eligible for ABD. So the process to apply and get approved for HEN is pretty similar, actually mirrors ABD, so that's why we're going to be mostly focusing on ABD. But if you have a client who's maybe they don't have a chronic or long-term disability, but they're unable to work, they may be approved for HEN rather than ABD to get that housing and essential needs. So the HEN program, it provides funding to local governments and homeless service providers who then administer the program. So folks are referred by Department of Social Health Services, or DSHS. That's the state agency that runs all these public assistance programs. And then there's going to be a local provider in each county. So a lot of the income and resource information is the same as ABD, so I'll go into more detail in the ABD part. But essentially, it's for folks that are very low income. It's not a cash grant. That's the ABD program, but it's the housing and essential needs. It is for adults. And so DSHS determines eligibility for HEN. And then in King County, specifically, it's Catholic Community Services that actually administers the HEN program. So people start with DSHS, and then they get the referral to go to HEN. In King County, there's also a program called TEN. This is also administered through Catholic Community Services, and it is the essential needs part. So if somebody is on the wait list for rental assistance, or maybe they don't need the rental assistance, they can get the other part, the bus pass, the hygiene packs, that sort of thing. So getting HEN benefits, once an applicant or a client is approved, they've been found eligible for HEN, they'll get a letter or they'll be notified, maybe verbally. They should get a letter, but sometimes people are told over the phone first that they qualify for HEN. The client has to affirmatively reach out to Catholic Community Services and do an intake for HEN. They can do that by calling the resource line or actually going in person to the Phoenix Center, which is a drop-in center. There may even be some social workers or case managers from HEN on the call today. And if there's any more information you want to add about HEN, feel free to put that in the chat, or we could have you come off mute at the end of the program. The reason why I want to stress that clients have to affirmatively contact HEN for an intake is because it can be a little confusing. A client will get a letter in the mail saying you've been referred, for this HEN program. And so clients may think, well, somebody's going to contact me, or I'll just wait for the call. But that's not the case. They do have to affirmatively reach out. So no call or visit to Catholic Community Services means somebody's not going to get those HEN benefits. So one thing that we're going to be talking about in today's presentation is, what happens when you're transitioning from these state benefits to federal benefits. And a lot of times people are receiving ABD and HEN while they're going through the process to get SSI or Social Security Disability, which often takes longer than to get the state benefits. So generally the rule is eligibility for HEN ends after your SSI is approved. But there is currently some limited funding available for folks in King County that are already having their rent paid through HEN to continue receiving that rental assistance even after they've transitioned to SSI. I'm not part of HEN or Catholic Community Services, so I don't have much more information than that. So I would just encourage folks, if you have a client that maybe recently transitioned to SSI or they're about to, they can reach out to their HEN case manager or the resource line to get more information about how they may be able to keep the rental assistance part after their SSI gets approved. The TEN eligibility, that the essential needs part, that does end after SSI is approved. Okay, so that was just a quick detour about the HEN program, and now I want to start talking about the Age Blind and Disabled program. It's a cash assistance program to low-income individuals in Washington State. The maximum amount anyone can receive is $417 a month for an individual, $528 if you're a married couple. And when somebody is approved for ABD, they also get help applying for SSI, and then they get that referral to the HEN program. So who is eligible? I'm going to just briefly go through the basics so that we can dive into more detail. So if somebody is over 65, that's the aged part. If they're blind, or if they have a disabling physical or mental condition that keeps them from being able to work for at least 12 months. They don't have to have already been out of work for 12 months. It's just that they're expected to not be able to work. It's considered more of a long-term or chronic disability. The disability cannot be primarily due to drug or alcohol use. The person has to be at least 18 years old, and there are income, resource, and citizenship immigration requirements. So as I mentioned, there are income and resource limits. A lot of the clients we work with, they come to us without any income. So if you're working with a client that has zero income, zero resources, this isn't going to be much of a barrier. They're going to be found financially eligible for the program. But if you do have a client that maybe is working very part-time, maybe they're making $200 working at the stadium, or they're able to do some Uber food delivery, maybe they can make $150 a month, something like that, they may still be income eligible for the program. If someone's income is from a job, we call that earned income, DSHS will actually only count 50% of that gross income, and that's their countable income. So the example I used, if you have a client, they're able to get a couple shifts working at the stadium during the summer, let's say they make $200 a month, DSHS is going to only consider that they're making $100 a month. That's their countable income. You can see the monthly income limit here in the chart. So they're making $100 a month, they're going to be income eligible. There's another type of income that's called unearned income. That's basically income from anything other than employment. So veterans benefits, unemployment benefits, if they're getting maybe some other type of pension or some other type of unearned income, then that is counted dollar for dollar, and that income has to be less than that 417 program standard. So if you're meeting with a client and they tell you that they're getting $500 in VA benefits, they're going to be over the income limit and not eligible for these benefits. There is also a resource limit. You have to have less than $6,000 in liquid resources, which is basically cash or things that can be turned into cash. So that would include checking, savings accounts, of course, cash on hand. And then you're allowed to have a car with a value of up to $10,000. So there's actually some changes coming, and it's not just to ABD, it's all cash programs. So if you work with families that are on TANF, this would also apply to those clients. So starting February 1st, 2022, the resource limit is going from $6,000 to $12,000, and they're going to waive the value of one car. So if you have a client that maybe has been denied ABD because their car has been valued at more than $10,000, as of February 1st, 2024, that won't be an issue for them anymore. Okay, so just briefly, how do you actually apply for these benefits? I'm sure most of the folks on the call already know this, but you can apply online at washingtonconnection.org. That's DSHS's homepage. You do need to be able to have an email address because they send a verification code. So just keep that in mind. Folks can apply in person at the local DSHS office, over the phone, or you can mail in or fax in a paper application. So this is a copy. If you haven't seen it before, this is the paper version of the application. I wanted to just point out that you can see in the yellow highlighted, this is the one application for food and cash. So there isn't a specific application for ABD or HEN. It's just this one application. You just check the box for what you're looking for. So if you check the box for cash, and in number 18, where you're listing the family members, if you include minor children, that family is going to be screened for cash assistance through TANF. If you check cash and you just list yourself or your spouse or maybe another adult in the household, then you're going to be screened for ABD cash. And then childcare is also, that's another program. And then so you could apply for food and cash at the same time. So I wanted to spend a little bit on the application process and dig a little deeper here, because oftentimes clients have challenges even just getting through the application process. So there's two parts to this application process. There's a financial interview, which basically just confirms the information that was submitted on the application. If you've ever helped a client apply for cash, either food or ABD, you'll notice the application, it mostly just asks questions about income and finances. It doesn't really get into the disability part. So the financial interview can be done over the phone, in person, it could be done online, you could mail or fax in the application. But there's an important second part of the ABD application process, which is the social worker interview. And this is when the social worker will talk to the client about, their disabilities and why they're not able to work. So if a client just applies online or just mails in an application, they're not done yet. They have to have done the social worker interview. So sometimes when we meet with a new client, we specifically ask, okay, have you actually talked to the social worker? Have you told them about your disabilities, your doctor's information? And if they say no, we know that we need to help the client get that done. If someone goes in person or they're over the phone, these two interviews are usually done, they talk to one person and then they get transferred to the next person. So it's usually done in one sitting. So the social worker interview, why this is important. This is because this is the time where the client gets to tell DSHS about all the physical and mental health conditions that they have that are making it difficult for them to work. And this is what's going to be used to determine whether they meet the rules for eligibility or not. So I always encourage clients to tell DSHS about everything that they're dealing with, even things that might seem minor, like high blood pressure or nightmares. And the reason that is because sometimes, a client's really focused on the physical or the mental health, but that might not be sufficient enough, or there might just not be enough medical evidence to have them approved based on that. But a combination of physical and mental health or different impairments, that might be enough to get them, kind of over the finish line and approved. And if they don't share that information with DSHS, the social worker isn't going to know to look into that. Also, during the interview, the client needs to tell DSHS the names and addresses of all their medical providers seen in at least the last 30 days. 90 days. They can share more, but they need to generally at least share the last 3 months. And that includes primary care, specialists, hospital, emergency rooms, maybe their therapist office. And why this is important is because that social worker is going to request medical records from all these providers. So if the client doesn't share the name of a provider or clinic, the social worker isn't going to know. Sometimes clients they'll say to me, I'm on Medicaid, DSHS should know where I'm getting my care. But that's not the case. DSHS doesn't track or monitor where people are going for their medical care. So they're not going to know unless they tell the social worker. And after they've done the social worker interview, if there is a change, maybe they've gone to a new hospital or they've been diagnosed with something new, they're going to want to update DSHS with that information because DSHS isn't monitoring or keeping up with their medical care. They're just going to request the records, and whatever the records say, that's what they're going to use. So some tips for the application process. One thing I will say is that advocates can absolutely attend the financial and social worker interviews, which you all may already be doing with your clients. You can be on the phone with them, you can go in person, as long as the client is okay with it. It's a really good point for advocacy. Another tip is if you can help your client get copies of medical records, that's going to expedite the process. That's what caseworkers usually ask me, like, how can I get this done quicker for my client? So if you can help the client, if they use a program like MyChart, a client portal with their doctor, and if they can just download a copy of their test results or their doctor's appointments, or go to the provider, or maybe you are working within a provider's office, if you can just help the client get those medical records, that's probably going to be quicker than DSHS requesting it, and then receiving it back. You can also help the client ask DSHS to schedule a psychological evaluation if that's necessary. We're going to get a little bit into that later on. Advocates, of course, the client as well, can also follow up with the DSHS social worker to actually make sure they are getting the medical records, or if there's any issues with getting the medical records, you'll know about it, so you can try to help troubleshoot that. Advocates can write letters of support for their clients or help clients ask their medical providers for these letters of support. And I do have a section about that later on in the presentation. Another tip, you all, of course, may already be doing this, but if not, you can have your client sign an authorization to disclose information to and from DSHS, of course, only if the client wants to sign this form. But this will allow you to talk to DSHS during this ABD process on behalf of the client when they're not there. So you can have the client sign this and submit it with their initial application, and then you can follow up with the social worker, even if the client isn't with you on the phone. Okay, so that's the application process and some of the barriers and solutions to getting through that step. Now, the next part is about the actual disability evaluation of the application. So what does disability actually mean in the context of ABD? Well, it means that somebody is unable to work because of a diagnosed physical or mental health impairment that is or that has or is expected to last at least 12 months. So you'll notice unable to work That's the first 3 letters. And that's really what these benefits are for. It's not just that you have a disability, but that's keeping you from working. And what does work actually mean? Well, it has to be substantial work. So if somebody's working very part-time, that's not going to disqualify them from these benefits. There's actually a term, I bet Hui's going to talk more about this because it's borrowed from Social Security, called substantial gainful activity. It's a dollar amount that's determined every year that if you're earning $1,400 a month, you're working significantly. So if your client is working very part-time or sporadically, they may still be eligible because their work isn't going to be considered substantial. I also wanted to touch on co-occurring disorders. This is something that questions we get asked a lot. If you have a client that does have a substance use disorder or a chemical dependency condition, they can still apply and may still be approved for ABD. That isn't going to disqualify them alone. The rule is that the disability cannot be primarily due to alcohol or drug addiction. So if there's a co-occurring disorder, an underlying mental health disorder, or a physical impairment that would persist even during periods of sobriety, a client may still get approved for these benefits. Sometimes after someone is approved, they may be required to do a SUDS assessment or treatment in order to maintain those benefits. Okay, so how do you actually prove that the client is disabled such that they can't work? So what happens is the client gives recent medical evidence about the conditions, including the diagnosis and how it actually impacts your work. So it's 2 parts. It's the diagnosis and how it impacts your work. If you need help, or I should say if the client needs help getting or paying for medical records or exams to prove their disability, DSHS is required to help you. In fact, they will request the medical records. So even if your client doesn't request the records themselves, DSHS is going to go out, request, and pay for those medical records. I wanted to do just a quick note here. I mentioned that you have to have a diagnosis. So, part 1 is diagnosis, and then the second part is how does it impact your work? Well, not every healthcare professional can provide the diagnosis that's required for ABD eligibility. This is sometimes something else we see with our clients. A reason why they've been denied or it's being delayed is because they have a diagnosis, but it wasn't from an acceptable medical source. That's the term DSHS uses. So I won't read through this list. You all will get copies of the slides or maybe already have them, but this is the list of doctors who can diagnose a physical impairment. And then this is the list who can diagnose a mental health impairment. So sometimes something that we see is a client has been working with a mental health care practitioner. And so that's who's diagnosed them with severe depression, for example. Well, because that person isn't a psychiatrist or a psychologist, they don't have the diagnosis needed to get them approved for these benefits. So what you can do, as a case manager is if you're able to help the client get a referral to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or maybe the clinic that they go to does have someone like that on staff, but they've just been seeing the mental health practitioner. If you can help advocate so that they can get that mental health assessment, then they can get the diagnosis they need. If that's not possible, you can ask DSHS to schedule a psychological evaluation. They have doctors that they contract with that will do these evaluations over the phone to get this formal diagnosis, and it is free to clients. So we talked about the first part, diagnosis. The second part is, well, how does it show that you're not able to work? So after you have that diagnosis, the list of healthcare providers who can explain how the impairment impacts someone's ability to work, it's a much broader category. So this is where input from social workers, mental health practitioners, physical therapists, that's where that information is going to be helpful. And this information generally comes from medical records or letters of support. So if your client has been diagnosed with anxiety, the mental health practitioner that they're seeing, they might do a mental status exam and show that the client's mood is very anxious. So that's how DSHS is going to know that this person is very anxious and then maybe can't work, in a crowded room, something like that. Another part is this information comes through physical and psychological evaluations or assessments. So I mentioned if the client doesn't already have a formal diagnosis of maybe a mental health impairment, DSHS can schedule a free psychological evaluation. One tip here is if you know your client hasn't had much treatment, in the last 90 days, 6 months, a year, you can ask for this during the interview process and see if you can get that set up instead of, waiting 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the road and then having that set up. A client's medical provider may also be asked to complete an evaluation form. We usually see this happen when there's a physical condition, and I'll give you an example of what that looks like on the next slide. And if the client needs help paying for a certain exam, a test, some radiology, you can ask DSHS to pay for this. And in certain situations, they are required to pay for it. And if you are working with a client who's having trouble getting DSHS to pay for a type of test or exam, that would be a good time to reach out to us because we might be able to help advocate on behalf of the client. So this is just the first page of the physical evaluation form, just so you all have an example. I've included a link to the physical and mental health form as well. And what I wanted to note here is you don't have to wait for DSHS to send out this evaluation. If you're working with a client and they have a good relationship with their mental health provider or their physical, their primary care doctor, you can help the client. You could print off a copy of this form, help the client bring it to their provider to fill it out. You don't have to wait for DSHS to say, okay, now we need this form. That's another way you can get an application pushed through more quickly, is if you are able to help the client get these forms filled out and turned into DSHS. So I mentioned letters of support, and this is a really great area of advocacy for case managers and mental health practitioners. It's always going to have more weight if it's the client's mental health or physical health provider that writes this letter or fills out these forms, but that doesn't mean that other case managers or social workers shouldn't also do these letters. And in fact, if your client gets denied and has to go in front of a judge for a hearing, we as attorneys, these letters of supports are actually really helpful. So just some advice about how to write these letters. You always want to introduce yourself, your credentials, your relationship to the client, how long you've worked with them, how often you interact with them. If you know anything about their diagnosis or have any medical records, absolutely attach that with the letter. And you want the letter to mostly focus on symptoms and impairments that you have personally seen or experienced. And that is because the more specific examples that you can provide, the stronger the letter is going to be. And the more specific you can be, the easier it is to tie what you've observed with a work-like activity. Because again, this whole process is about why is the person not able to work? So there are some examples on this page, but on this next page, you can see that, instead of just saying something like, I don't think this client can work, they should be approved for benefits. It's going to be more persuasive if you can, talk about if they struggle with personal hygiene, or if you have examples of trouble with concentration, if you need to give the client several reminders or they miss their appointment. All of these can be related to work-like activities. Like an employer isn't going to call the client every day before their shift. If they keep missing work, they're probably going to lose the job. So just some examples about how to be specific in these letters of support. So some tips for the evaluation process, kind of to wrap up this section. One of the issues or challenges we see with these cases is DSHS will request medical records directly from the providers, but this can take time. There's not a lot of follow-up on the side of DSHS, and they may only ask for a limited date range. So I like to mention this because if your client had a severe back injury a year ago, and that's when they have all their imaging and all the testing done, if DSHS just requests 3 months of medical records, they might not get all that imaging. Excuse me, just a moment. All right, sorry about that. So a solution or tips to overcome these challenges is, again, if you can help a client get a copy of their medical records and submit that directly to DSHS, that's going to move things along more quickly. If you can follow up with the DSHS, excuse me, I'm sorry, everyone, I have a frog in my throat. to ensure those requests are being made, they're getting the medical records. I know it's hard to get through to DSHS on the phone or in the lobby, but if you can at least keep track of your attempts to get in touch with, the social worker or the customer service line, that is going to be helpful if the client does end up having to appeal. And that could actually help the client get more back benefits than, if there's no record of them trying to get in touch with DSHS. And then again, you can help the client schedule a physical or evaluation with their primary care provider or ask DSHS to set that up. So some reasons that ABD commonly gets denied is maybe the evidence wasn't received within the deadline. There's usually 45 days they have to process the application. Maybe the evidence received is it's not current, it's from last year or 2 years ago. There might just not be a lot of medical records. Maybe the client just hasn't been getting a lot of treatment. The physical or mental health evaluations, maybe they weren't completed or not completed fully. And then a mental health evaluation done by one of the DSHS contracted providers might have implicit bias in their evaluation. And what I mean by that is, of course, everybody has implicit bias, and it's not anything specific against these doctors, but they don't know your client. This might be the first time that they're talking to your client. They talk over the phone generally. It's about an hour long, so they may just not have the full story. So if you're able to get your client's primary care provider or their own mental health provider to do an assessment, that's probably going to be a little bit stronger because they know the client, there's longevity, they can speak to, all the history of the mental health impairment. If they need that diagnosis, it's okay to go to the DSHS doctor's appointment. But if you can also supplement with a evaluation from their own provider, it's going to make a stronger case. So another question that we get that I wanted to talk about today is, when should someone appeal an ABD denial versus when should someone just reapply? Well, if you think DSHS was correct in the denial, but your situation has changed, maybe it's been a couple months, or you have a new diagnosis, or you went back to work, but then you lost your job again, something's changed, that might be a situation where you want to reapply. There is also something called a reconsideration, and this is if you get denied, DSHS, if you give DSHS additional information within 30 days of the denial, they will re-review your application and you can possibly get approved at that stage. You can ask for a reconsideration and a hearing at the same time. They're not exclusive, mutually exclusive. But if you think DSHS incorrectly denied the benefits, the client does have a diagnosis, or you did submit medical records, that might be a situation where you want to appeal. And if you're in one of these situations, you're not sure if you should appeal or help the client reapply, email Ask a Lawyer. That's a great program. That's a great use of that email address. And the reason why sometimes it makes sense to appeal versus reapply is you may be able to get back benefits if you appeal instead of just reapplying. I just looked at the time. We're about 9:45. I have just a few more slides, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly so I can make sure we get all the information before I hop off. All right, so let's say your client does get approved. Now what? How do you avoid what we call our benefit pitfalls? One important thing is to report changes in circumstances. This will prevent someone from, being terminated or have their benefits being reduced. So the rule is generally you have to report a change by the 10th day of the month following the change that had happened. So what that means is if somebody starts working and they get their first paycheck on September 1st, they need to tell DSHS about that by October 10th, so the 10th day of the month following that change. If you're not sure what or how or when to report something, you can, of course, contact DSHS or reach out to us at BLA, and we can give some information about that reporting. Another way to avoid a benefit pitfall is to comply with treatment if required, or tell DSHS why you can't comply as soon as you aren't able to comply. So if somebody's been approved for ABD, but they have to do a mental health treatment, But let's say maybe they were living in North Seattle, they lost their housing, now they're living in South Seattle, so they just physically can't get to that clinic again. That's something that they'd want to report to DSHS right away, because if you have a good reason for not complying, you can avoid having your benefits terminated. But if you don't report that to DSHS, they wouldn't know, and you might lose or be faced with a termination of benefits. Another option is to get an equal access plan, or ask DSHS that your client be screened for an equal access plan. This is similar to like a disability accommodation, although it's not just based on, physical or mental health disability. It could be sensory impairment, neurological. So this could look like clients get a call in addition to letters. They get to have help filling out forms. They can have a quiet space in the office to meet with their DSHS worker. They can get letters in large print. They can get additional time to fill out forms. These are all things that can be part of an equal access plan. Another option is for the client to designate an authorized representative, which is someone who can talk to DSHS on their behalf, and DSHS will share information. It could be an individual or an organization. And what we do for some of our clients is we have a limited authorized representation in place so that we can get copies of their DSHS notices. So if you have a client who has trouble getting their mail, maybe they're chronically unhoused, if you can get a copy of their notice and then help them fill out, their reviews or get that information, that can help them avoid, constantly having their benefits turned off and turned back on. So what if you do everything exactly like we talked about, but something still goes wrong for your client? They get denied, reduced, terminated, maybe there's an overpayment. So clients can appeal these adverse actions. That's what we call, anything that impacts someone's benefits. And how to appeal is the client requests a hearing, an administrative hearing. They can do this by calling or writing DSHS or the Office of Hearing Administration. They have a right to be represented by an attorney. And on this slide, I've just included a couple phone numbers that they can call. So there's no magic word to request a hearing. There is technically a hearing request form, but clients don't have to fill that out. They just have to tell DSHS that they don't agree, they want to appeal, they think they are disabled, just expressing disagreement with the decision. That's supposed to be enough to trigger a hearing request. But that doesn't always happen. So if you as a caseworker can make a note that the client requested a hearing, if you can help them call to request a hearing, just to make sure that, it's actually being noted that they want to appeal that decision. Generally, you have 90 days from the date of the letter, the denial or the termination letter. But if someone is more than 90 days, they can still request a hearing. They just have to explain why they have a good reason for being late with the hearing request. If someone's benefits are about to be terminated or denied, they may be able to get continuing benefits, so keep their benefits while the hearing is pending. There are some specific deadlines, though, that you have to make sure you follow to get those benefits. Okay, I made it through all this section with about 10 minutes to spare. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody. And then if I do have to hop off, the rest of my team is on the phone and can also jump in. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Hannah. And folks, I've been putting it into the chat. I'm honestly not sure what happened with the Zoom link for some of y'all. So you have insight into that. I would love to hear it so we can avoid it for next time. And I'm so sorry. We've got two questions that have come in through the chat. So one kind of going back to the beginning of the presentation, Hannah, and it says, are ABLE accounts counted in the resource cap?
Okay, that's a great question. I believe the answer is no. If Will Ross is on the phone, I think he's recently maybe had ABLE accounts. He can hop in and answer that. But I believe the answer is they're not counted as a resource. That's why they're specifically built so that they're excluded as a resource. But if someone is getting money from the ABLE account, that might be considered income. So that's just something to think about. And if I'm wrong about that, Will, if you're on the phone.
I think that's right, Hannah.
Okay,
This
Brittany,
is
thank you.
Brittany on the team. I found the link for the FAQs also on the Washington State ABLE link, and it says it does not interfere with state benefits in addition to not interfering with federal up to 100K in the account. So I'll put the link.
Thanks so much, Brittany. Thanks for being here too.
Wonderful. I'm loving the teamwork. And then there's another question that I think came in, and then I think you actually started to address it, but I think it's worth repeating. So it says, if a client was denied because they didn't get enough information from medical professionals, can the client reapply later? And so I think that had come in as you were starting to get into some of the details, but maybe just highlighting the recap.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, the client can reapply. And what often happens in these cases is the client applies on their own. Either the provider doesn't respond to the medical records request, or maybe it's received too late. And so when the client reapplies, if you are able to assist to make sure that they get those medical records, or maybe you're able to get them on your own, the client can absolutely reapply. If you think if there were medical records received, that might be a situation where they might want to appeal. You could actually appeal and apply at this and reapply. You can do both. If there were no medical records received, there were no medical records available, then yeah, reapplying could be a good option for that client.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in through the chat. Brittany, thank you for throwing in that link into the chat. We'll make sure we capture all that and get all that into the blog for when we do our follow-up. I will be sure to do my best today to download the training today and get it onto our YouTube account, and I will get our YouTube account there. So since we did have issues with the link and we were able to get the correct link out after we'd started, you can at least have access sooner than later, because Tim is actually out today, and so he usually does that beautiful blog. And so I think that'll end up being a little bit delayed. So hopefully we won't keep this information from you all. Okay. And thank you all for giving me the insight as to what was happening on your end. We will double check all of our links for future trainings. Another question, does funding for HEN sometimes run out, causing apartments not to get paid?
I don't think so. So for HEN, we mostly work on the eligibility side, so someone actually getting approved for HEN. So I'm not able to speak too much to the actual administration of HEN. Other times that we've done the ABD program, we've done ABD and HEN, and we've had our colleagues with Catholic Community Services in HEN, they join. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that question. I'm not sure. Someone raised their hand. Oh, and it looks like they're a HEN case manager. Perfect, Sophia, thank you. Can you jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to eligibility and funding, as long as we're never going to run out of funding for someone who's already on our program. So if it is, we're like struggling with funding, it's going to be impeding us from getting new clients on board, not so much as like not paying rent for people we have already.
Thanks, Sophia. I'm glad you're on the call to answer those questions. Yeah. Oh, actually, Sophia, there's another question in the chat that is also HEN related. Maybe you can speak to that one. Does HEN always support with rent for new referrals? I've heard they don't currently.
That is a great question. So right now, mostly the process we're going through is at our Phoenix Center, enrolling people and sort of prioritizing people already housed and getting them rental assistance. So we don't have a really timeline for it. Sometimes it goes really quick. I've seen clients who it's like a couple weeks, they're already onto our program. And sometimes it's been people for a couple months. I think that answered the question. I think I also forgot the question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah,
I'll
so
ask. Oh, I was sorry. Go
yeah,
ahead.
does
Jody.
HEN always support with rent for new referrals? I've heard they currently don't. And yeah, my understanding is there's not enough funding for new HEN referrals. That's my understanding.
Yes and no. We have been
Okay.
going through like waves of getting a good amount of clients sent over to receiving rental assistance. Like as a case manager, I think I've gotten probably around like 30 new clients that I've added to my case that were like starting to pay rents for and get all those housing documents. So yeah, it really depends, I would say, on like the timeline and when they're applying. But right now we did receive some funding, so we are like moving people actively over to get rental assistance.
That is wonderful. Absolutely great.
I can definitely drop the Phoenix Center in the chat, and that's where you could send all the clients to enroll, and so they can start in that process for HEN.
Thank you, Sophia. Glad you are here. Appreciate it. Okay, I don't think I've missed any other. So we got somebody else saying the only time that rent is not paid is if the client tenant is not in compliance. The client needs to check in every 90 days. Yeah, and I'm gonna drop a I think some stuff has started to change more recently, and so I'm going to drop also a blog that includes some of the program management from HEN and over at the Phoenix Center, for, like where Sophia's going to drop in, that also has slides and information, and then you can like have all that contact information and sort of see what was true as of April this year. And again, it sounds like from what Sophia is saying, that there's been some funding that has allowed stuff to come in. So I'm going to drop that in. And yes, Hannah, thank you for being here. We super appreciate it. Good luck with the advocacy you're doing today on behalf of folks. We really appreciate Brittany and Will being here for further stuff. And I think we are going to go ahead and probably move on to Hui and the federal side of it. So Hui, welcome. You are still on mute.
Oh, give me 1 second. I'm having some technical difficulties with PowerPoint.
Oh, all right. Well,
1 second.
holler if you need me to do something.
Okay. Let's see. For some reason, it's not letting me share my screen. Zoom accessibility.
Let me make you the, well, I want to make you the host, but you are a co-host as far as I can tell.
Okay, let me try again.
Okay.
It says open system preferences. Oh, here we go. This will do it. Oh, can people hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, here we go. Sorry. This should work. Can people see the screen?
Yes, you're looking good.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Technology. You'd think after 3 years of Zooming, this would be easier, but it's not. So
Yeah, well,
everybody,
here we are.
My name is Hui Win. I'm the executive director of the Benefits Law Center here in Seattle, Washington. We work with people who are navigating the Social Security system, and we work mostly in King County. We're about 5 attorneys, soon to be 6 in September, and 2 paralegals. And so we're a smaller, scrappier crew, but we do work a lot with SSI benefits, supplemental security income benefits. Whoops. Give me 1 second here. Oh, give me 1 second. I think I may have the wrong slide. So hold up. Let's see. Escape. Yeah, this is the wrong slide. It's another slide I want. Let's see. Not this one. Here we are. Okay. So this one. Slideshow. Are folks able to see my screen? Okay, great. Sorry about that. Oh, this is actually the older one. I'm sorry. I have so many PowerPoint slides. So give me a couple minutes here before we get started. That's the wrong one.
If it is easy, I've got the one that you sent to Tim yesterday or the day before, if that's there.
Oh, no, that's an older one. That was last time's. Yeah, are you able to share screen?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, Jody, yeah, if you
Yep.
could, it'd be great, because I'm having some technical difficulties here.
No worries. Let me pull this up. Let me do this. And actually do this. Okay.
Actually,
Alright.
I may have figured it out. Give me 1 second.
Oh, okay.
Here we are.
Okay.
Oh my goodness, sorry about that, everybody. There was like 8 slides open, PowerPoint slides open on my screen. And so it was just a matter of toggling to the correct one. And let me get started on this.
No worries. We are in it together. I think this crew has been around for a while in all of our public benefits, so you're in good company. Take it away.
Right. So I'm going to be talking about supplemental security income, SSI and SSDI. Just to give you a brief overview, there will be a little bit of overlap or some overlap from the last training in January. So if you watch that, you can watch this one. There'll be some overlap. And also the information that Hannah presented, which was really excellent and extremely thorough. A lot of that, there is some overlap with Social Security, but then there's not, because we're now dealing with a federal program. And that means we're dealing with the federal government, which is much more bureaucratic and much more mired in red tape. And there's a little bit less protections. For example, when Hannah talked about equal access, there isn't a specific equal access program for Social Security. You can ask for accommodations, but whether or not that will be documented or provided to you in an equitable or efficient way is going to be hit and miss. And so a lot of those state protections, which are very, very strong, like interpretations of notices, currently is not available to folks on Social Security and through the federal government. And the excuse that we get a lot of times about why something is so strong on a state level versus a federal level is that the federal government is limited in terms of their funding. It's a finite amount in terms of their budget. However, what that also means is that many of these services, many of these resources, which are very important to people who are low income and also have disabilities or not housing stable, that becomes a very difficult thing in their lives because they will encounter a lot of instability as a result of either losing their benefits or having a break in their benefits. And so that is something that is much more dire and much more bleak on the federal level. We will go over some income and resources issues. And now I'll talk about the application and process and eligibility. And then how to communicate with SSA. That's a big one because that's where we see a lot of the traps and pitfalls that people encounter when trying to communicate with the federal government, which I've mentioned before is very big. And not as well funded as the state benefits or offices, although both can be very difficult to navigate. And then just one quick update about SSI and ABD back pay. 1 second here. So the 2 benefit programs that we are talking about today are SSI. So that is supplemental security income, and these are individuals who meet the income and resource limits and the medical eligibility requirements. There's no work history required, as opposed to SSDI, which is Social Security Disability Insurance, is for individuals who have earned enough work credits and meet medical eligibility requirements. It's a little bit similar to ABD, but a little bit different too. And we'll talk about those differences in a second. Here we see just really quick the differences between SSI. So SSI, you have to be 65 years old or older, or blind or disabled, meaning the Social Security's definition of disabled, have resources less than $2,000. So that is something that is a huge problem for folks on SSI, because they are looking at having to spend down resources in order to keep their benefits, and going over that resource limit of $2,000 will render you ineligible for SSI. And in some cases, you can have a overpayment. You have a limited income, so about $1,470. And then there are citizenship requirements. That's its own training, I believe. And that's something if folks want to hear about in terms of the citizenship requirements for SSI or SSDI, that's something that can be quite complicated. And if you go to DSHS EAZ manual, there is actually decision trees on the different types of statuses, which can be very complicated, about who can qualify, who cannot qualify based on citizenship status. There's also a 5-year bar concept where for legal permanent residents, you cannot get access benefits within a 5-year bar, a 5-year time limit. As opposed to SSDI, which is you meet the Social Security's definition of disabled, and then you also have sufficient work credits of up to 10 years. And this is based on the amount that you make within a credit, 4 credits, up to 4 credits per year. So that's a duration of time. So I believe it's so about 3 months time was a 1 credit, and there's 4 up to each year. And so you have to have at least 10 years of credits to be able to qualify for Social Security disability insurance. So it's like an insurance program. So are you eligible at the time based on the work credits and based on the disability? So it's deemed on your history, your work history, and the amount of time that you've worked. And that can time out too. That gets rather difficult, but you can time out if you haven't worked in a certain time period, and you can lose your credit. So that's something to think about when you're working with someone with a work history. But as you can see, the biggest difference between SSI and SSDI is that SSDI does not have a resource limit. So you could be Mark Zuckerberg or Bezos, someone like who is a billionaire, and still get Social Security disability as long as you have the sufficient work credits and work history, and that you meet the definition of a disability according to Social Security. So you can still get that just as long as your income is not going to be over a certain amount. Of course, they're probably, even with a disability, they're probably getting returns on stocks and things like under an income. So they probably would not qualify based on income. But as you can see here, it's not a limitation or barrier to qualifying on SSDI. However, it is for SSI for folks that don't have those sufficient work history. So folks with developmental disabilities, chronic disabilities, folks who are caretakers but weren't paid for it, right? So for a certain amount of time, that's not showing up on Social Security anywhere. So those are folks that are at risk. And of course, folks who are homeless or in situations where they're houseless and there's a lot of instability, inability to keep track of their taxes or their medical records becomes really difficult when they don't have access to a lot of technology and things like that. So those are all things that would be more likely for someone on SSI as opposed to someone on SSDI. So how does Social Security define disability? So just because you were found eligible for ABD benefits, which has a very similar standard for disability, that is something that is a little bit more entrenched when you appeal on a Social Security federal government level. So the average rates of denial, so when someone is applying for Social Security, let's say they get on ABD and they're applying for Social Security, about 70% of applicants who apply for Social Security are denied. That means you are going to hearing unless you can provide information that will convince them pre-hearing that you qualify for Social Security. So that's something that can be very tricky to navigate, but is an issue for many folks is that about 70% of people who apply are denied, and therefore they are headed towards an administrative law judge hearing where there's evidence and witnesses and testimony that must be taken. And we'll talk about why that's important to lock in your application date for retroactive back pay. But here we see 5 steps, and these are 5 steps that every person who's denied will have to go through to show. So it's not just about medical, it can be other types of things also. So first step is financial, which is usually easy, that they can show that they're making less than a certain amount, and it's 1470. That's a substantial gainful activity amount. So that amount is, if you're making over that amount, then you are not eligible under federal government guidelines for a disability. So that's step 1. Step 2 is, do you have a severe impairment that prevents you from working or expected to prevent you from working? So like Hannah was saying, you don't necessarily have to be working at the time, but it's expected that you'd be not able to work for at least 12 consecutive months. So you don't need multiple, you can just have one. So one impairment can prevent you from working. If that does prevent you from working for at least 12 months, then that's something you move on to step 3. So all these steps are in a sequence, and you have to go through one after another. And you can, if you don't meet a sequence at any point, like at point 2 or 3, you can be denied there, and they'll stop moving forward. But basically the judge or the hearing rep or DDS will basically, or the Division of Disability Determination Services will make a determination based on these 5 sequential steps. So, and then the third is listing criteria. So this goes through what your medical records say in terms of what they've collected, and in terms of listings, so that someone would experience at least one disabling which they have received consistent long-term treatment for. So does your condition, does your impairments, does your barriers that you're experiencing because of a medical issue meet what's in the Social Security listings in terms of their criteria? And if it does, then you move on to step 4, which is the person applying for benefits must be able to perform any work they have performed in the past. So they look to what you've done in the past, and are you able to do that? And if the answer is no, so if you were a customer service representative, if you were a call center person, are you still able to do that work that you've done in the past? And if the answer is no, then you go on to step 5, which is a step that is a little bit out of your control. So this is where we see a lot of people get snagged up in step 5, which is the person applying for benefits must be unable to perform the requirements of any job anywhere in the national economy. So this is where you at hearing have very little say, right? What happens is that the judge will create a persona, someone who's like you, with your very same conditions and impairments and disabilities, and then a job expert will come in. And that person will testify based on this fictitious person that's based on you. And that person will look to see, is there any other type of job in the national economy? And it's anywhere. So even if you grew up if you're in a rural area, you are still being held to the national economy. So the urban areas, right? So even if there's no job available in your rural area, they still look to the national economy to see if you're able to do any job that is of significant number, right? So that's information that very often an attorney will have to try to counter to say, no, that is not a significant job, a job that's a significant with work in the national economy or at significant numbers. And so this is why it's very important to connect someone who's been denied for Social Security to get them to an attorney, because the attorneys are trained to argue a lot of these very technical legal arguments. And that's why when we see someone who is pro se or unrepresented go through the process versus someone who is represented by an attorney, that means that they're more likely to be approved for Social Security because of these very technical 5-step sequences, which some of it has nothing to do with you, very little to do with you, and more about some of these general things that are open in the economy, in the nation, and they will have that most updated information or know how to navigate that or understand what's missing in terms of these 5 sequential steps. There are representatives that are not attorneys that you can go to, and some of them can be very good, just as good as an attorney. But I do think it's important that if you are working with someone who's claiming to be a rep, that's not an attorney, that you do a little bit homework to make sure that they are qualified to do what they can do, and that they have your best interest in mind in regards to representing you at hearing. And again, just because they're not an attorney doesn't mean they're not going to be able to represent you effectively and efficiently, but just making sure that the person knows what they're doing and can be trusted and has your best interest in mind. For lawyers, they have something called the rules of professional responsibility. So those are things that, in terms of ethics, that we need to do when working with a client to avoid conflicts of interest and things like that. So that's something that's a little bit more of a safeguard as opposed to someone who's not an attorney. And the other part is that we have heard of places that are not licensed attorneys and providing representation at these hearings, because that's something you can do as a non-attorney. But we have heard of places that are not good, and that are not in the client's best interest. So just be careful if you are referring to them to make sure that it's vetted, and that, sometimes attorneys can be just as bad too. We've had that also, where attorneys have dropped the ball, dropped their clients. So that does happen, but it is kind of a field out there that you have to navigate. And here what we could see is the substantial gainful activity limit. So if you go over this in terms of income, in terms of work, like Hannah was talking about for the ABD program, you could still work part-time on a very limited basis. So it can be something like selling fruits or jam, preserved jam at a roadside stands, or working at the stadium as an usher or a ticket taker part-time on a very limited basis. But if you go over the substantial gainful activity amount, you are no longer eligible for Social Security. So that is something that's very important. So if you are working with someone who is working, making sure that they don't go over the SGA amounts, which goes up every year. As you can see here, last year in 2022, it was $1,350 for non-blinds, but in 2023, it's $1,470. So making sure that people who are working do not go over the SGA amount, because that will get them kicked off. Here we see that Hannah went over the different types of income. So we have earned income, which is income through work. Unearned income, which can be something like child support. That means income that's coming in that isn't the result of work. It could be a payout through a stock or bonds or something like that. So those are all things that are unearned income. It's very similar to ABD, that whatever income that you do get, that it will be split in half. And so there's exclusions, of course. So $20 exclusion for other types of income, and $65 a month for earned income. And whatever is left over from the amount of income is then cut in half and then applied to your SSI benefits to reduce that amount. So even with that rate cut in half, I would not go over the amount that's currently SGA. So be really careful, even though they are cutting things in half in terms of what you earn and applying it as a direct reduction of your benefits. I would stay away from the $1,470 amount, even with that cut in half, just to be careful. And if you're not sure, definitely call us, and I'll talk about how to get a referral to Benefits Law Center. But I think it's really important for folks who are working that they get advice about with their income, because it is something that if they get cut off on, they would have to reapply, which can cause a lot of instability. I'm not going to go over, there's other things with SSI and income that can be very difficult, that as a lawyer myself, I have trouble understanding. So it really, we're not going to discuss it here because it can be very complicated, but there are pilot programs that you can enroll in through SSI, or sheltered programs for work that allows you to go over a bit the substantial gainful activity amount, because they're looking to see what you can do. In some cases, those programs can be a trap. So if you're working too well, they may say, wow, we saw that you were working really well in this pilot program. We don't think you're disabled anymore, right? So those are things that can be a benefit, but at the same time can be a trap if you're working a little bit too well in the sheltered program. We're not going to, again, it can be very complicated in how they count income. It can be very mathematical, like doing algebra. And I think if you do have one of those types of cases, get it to a lawyer, where the lawyer can sit down and do the math on it, because it can be very complicated. So what I would say is that if you encounter someone in a pilot program for work that you're not sure in terms of how they're counting income, or if that may be a trap for them, then make sure to reach out to us to get some more specific legal advice on income, because it can be something that is very difficult. All right, the other trigger point or pain point for many people on SSI, again, people on SSDI, disability insurance, don't have a resource limit, but one of the pain points is the $2,000 limit. And that includes all types of resources, like bank accounts are the main ones, stocks and bonds, of course, things of value or assets like a property or car that's not exempt under the rules. Those will be counted as a resource. So if you have additional cars, in addition to the ones that are exempt, or additional house, like a vacation home, those are all things that are considered to be a resource. And if the value of that on the fair market is over $2,000, you are no longer eligible for SSI. And that is a hard and fast limit. If you are over $1 of the $2,000 limit, that means you do not qualify for social SSI. Again, there are exceptions, like I said. So a car, that is the primary use of transportation, a house, that is your primary place of residence. So if you live in the house, those are things that would not count towards a $2,000 limit, and you own the house, not part of it. But a $1,500 burial fund. So those are exempt resources. A lot of personal property, like your TV, your blender, your refrigerator, those are also usually exempt, like personal household goods. But bigger things like a bank account or a car or a home, you would be ineligible to have that as under the resource limits. So again, you are ineligible for the month that you're over the resource limit. And if you're over the resource limit for a duration of time, regardless of how little or how much you're over, you will have an overpayment for that month. So if for whatever reason, let's say you had a $2,000 bank account and you're sharing it with someone, and someone puts in there without them knowing an additional $10 just to keep it there because they thought, they were under $2,000, and you ended up having $2,010, and you don't recognize that for a year. And if Social Security learns of that, which they can learn of it by doing evaluations or comprehensive evaluations to have you come in to review your information, what would happen then is that you would have an overpayment of up to a year because you were over that limit, even by $10 in that same amount. As long as you were over, you then have an overpayment for that entire duration, which can be, in some cases we've seen anywhere between $20,000 to $50,000 to $70,000 overpayments based on the time that you were over, even if it was $1 or 1 cent. And so that's something that you can appeal for hardship waivers, but mostly it is something that you have an overpayment on. And in the worst case scenario, not only do you have an overpayment and have been terminated from the program, but if they feel you were doing it intentionally, so if it's an intentional program violation, that means that it could be sent over to the prosecutor's office for fraud. It would have to be a substantial amount usually, but the prosecutors won't tell us. It would have to be the federal prosecutors. They haven't told us before. We've heard rumors of about maybe $5,000 is when it would be referred over for fraud, for prosecution. But it's really uncertain, and I think it depends on the circumstances too. Anything income that's left over. So for example, let's say you are disabled and you have a personal injury lawyer. The personal injury lawyer is going to sue someone for causing your injuries that has now led to a disability, which is separate from your Social Security or SSI claim, right? So let's say you win, it was a car accident, and you get $50,000 at the beginning of the month. If you get $50,000 at the beginning of the month, you have until the next following month, the first day of the following month. So let's say you got it, the 28th, right? You got it on the 28th. You have till the 1st to spend down that $50,000 to $2,000 to be eligible for SSI. So that is something that if you know someone has something coming in terms of a settlement, in terms of money, that is something that they have to spend right away, like a lump sum, before the next month, before the 1st of the month, or otherwise it converts into Social Security, or it converts into a resource, and that person can be ineligible that month because they're over the 2,000 limit. And in some cases, they may also impact their food or their Medicaid, which will create problems for eligibility for getting their prescriptions or medicines or medical technology. So those are all things that can be very, very difficult for folks. And the other thing that you need to understand when you're working with someone who's getting a lump sum or a settlement of some sort, either personal injury or otherwise, is that you cannot give the resource away without fair market value exchange. This is something that we see a lot of. We see folks who have houses that they own free and clear, and they want to give it to their children to keep it in the family. So what we'll see a lot of times is people writing on the deed, I transferred this house to my child for $1 and love and affection, right? And the house is worth, let's say $700,000 free and clear. Well, that is not a fair market value exchange for $1 in love and affection. But we do understand the importance of, especially for communities of color, of maintaining resources and equity, and passing it down to family members to make sure that that resource is protected. However, SSI, or Social Security, does not agree currently. And so if you give something away without fair market value, depending on the value of what you gave away, you can be locked out of your benefits. So not only will they cut you off, but they will lock you out depending on how much you've given away for up to 3 years. So that means for 3 years, you cannot get SSI because you gave away a significant amount of resources without fair market exchange. The whole idea is that if there is a resource, they want you to be able to convert it to money and to be able to live on that, as opposed to getting SSI, because like I said, the budgets for federal government is finite, it's not infinite. And so they need to be able to protect their resources. So the whole concept is that you would sell whatever it is, the house, spend that down before you go back onto Social Security. So that's something that it can be very difficult. So if you are found eligible for SSI, there are retroactive payments. And so you usually have about 9 months to spend down the resource. So if you're newly eligible and you get a back pay, retro pay of about, not $60,000, like $30,000 or $20,000, you do have 9 months to pay to spend that down. And again, if you're over this resource limit, you have a couple options. You can either spend or use the resources. You can temporarily stop getting SSI or Medicaid, which can be rather tricky because you have to, you could encounter additional information that may make them think that you're not eligible. And of course, they're always looking for something to make you ineligible, right? Because that means less resources they have to spend. Or you can find another way to hold on to the resources and say Medicaid. We're not going to talk too much about it. ABLE accounts, for this third one, ABLE accounts is a really good resource, like Hannah was saying, and it's the same rules that apply for ABD, which is that the ABLE account, if the money is put into an ABLE account, then it won't be counted as a resource towards the resource limit. Some of the money that you get out may be counted as under an income. The other type of thing, which you may have also heard, that you can protect the resource is a special needs trust. And so we don't do special needs trust, but there are attorneys that we really trust in the community. And if you want to talk to us about it, we have a list. We may have a listing of potential attorneys that do special needs trusts. It's usually someone who also does probate, estate planning, and guardianships. That's usually seems to be the grouping of background and expertise for people that do special needs trust. A lot of that has to be done in a way that is very consistent and streamlined, because if you don't do it correctly, you could have that person lose their benefits while waiting for the special needs trust to be set up. So if you know someone's going to get money, I think it's important to reach out to the attorney to have that set up, because it's not something that gets set up overnight. It takes some time, and it takes some planning. So making sure that there's a seamless transition from the time that the person gets the money to the time that it goes into the ABLE account or special needs trust, to the point where the attorney then goes to the court to say, hey, can you approve the special needs trust court? And therefore, it's a special created document, specially created resource that's protecting the person's SSI and Medicaid. And it really requires a lot of work and pre-planning. So if you do anticipate that someone's going to get a lump sum for settlement, I think it's important to get in there early, because it's not something that can be set up overnight. It has to be done in advance, and it does take time for the court to approve it in terms of, getting that set up and putting it into the account. This is a list of things. So this goes back to number 1, I believe, where you can spend it. So you could spend it on everything, a lot of different things. And here you can see, these are the list of things that you could spend the extra resources that you have. In the most ridiculous situations that I've had, where someone had a lot of money and they need to get rid of it fast, and we couldn't get to someone to set up a special needs trust, you can go on vacation. So that was the thing I tell folks, is book a cruise. You can book a cruise, and as ridiculous as that sounds, that will not count towards the research limit, right? So it's really absurd, because a lot of times people have very little. So they try to find things that they can spend it on, like medical technology, or like here we see medical expenses. But entertainment or vacation will count as something that won't count against your resources. So if you book a cruise, if you go on vacation with that money, it won't be counted as a resource, and that's okay. Here you see personal hygiene, clothing. So a lot of this stuff does require some advice, so specific advice. You can pay off debts. Some people ask, should I prepay rent, right? Which it sounds really tempting, but in most cases, I would probably not advise. Just knowing what I know about landlords, I don't trust them. I don't trust many landlords, right? But that's the problem if you prepay rents, which we've seen some scenarios nationwide where someone has prepaid rent and the landlord ripped the money off. They just stole the money, or made something up and said, you didn't prepay it. And it becomes really difficult. So those are things that we try to advise people on, that if you do have extra resources, prepaying rents can come with very many problems in terms of that money. And there are other ways that you can protect your resources. If in doubt, like I said, get the person to talk to an attorney, or call us up with questions. We're happy to talk to folks about planning for this type of thing, because it is something that does require a little bit of planning. And like I said, it's a blessing and the curse at the same time. And that is something that can encounter a lot of roadblocks and barriers as a result. So we're going to talk about applications and what you may need to be aware of. Some of this, again, was in the last presentation in January, but we're going to go over it again really quick. And then we'll talk about communicating with Social Security, because that seems to be a huge pain point for many folks. And I'll try to leave time for questions at the end. So there are many ways to apply for benefits, Social Security benefits. And so there are 3 main ways, similar to ABD. However, there are different portals and different things that can happen, and also different response times or levels of responsiveness that are quite starkly different from the Department of Social and Health Services, DSHS, versus the Social Security Administration, which is much bigger and much more bureaucratic and red tape than DSHS programs. And so here we see you could do an online SSI appointment request tool. So that is SSI only, and we'll provide the links in the following slides. You can call SSA to schedule an application appointment. That's for both SSDI, and there's also an online application and follow-up. For many of our clients, they do not have access to technology. So it may be something that if you're working with a client, that they may be coming to you specifically to use a laptop or to use a computer. But what the problem with that is that they probably won't have access to computer either at home or wherever they're living, or calling home if you're living outside, that they may not have access to technology. So those are things that can be very difficult in terms of a barrier. There are a lot of times people who come in asking for help with an application where they don't understand some of the questions and they kind of need some assistance. So that's something that I do feel is very amenable for a social worker to do, or someone working with in emergency services or homeless or houseless services or social services can provide assistance with. But again, if you're not sure, please feel free to email us with questions about the questions on the application. But it is something that is a barrier for a lot of folks. So every method of applying for SSA benefits requires claimants to submit information about themselves and the impairments. A lot of the information that Hannah talked about in gathering the ABD medical and gathering or requesting a medical evaluation is almost identical to Social Security, the way they look at it. So they do use like a SSI facilitator who can help gather these types of things after scheduling or requesting appointments. And those are things that if you go to those links that are on the slide, you could see what they're looking for or how to get it, or how to ask Social Security to get it. So that's something you can ask for. You can also get evaluations through Social Security, although caveat, big asterisks about evaluations from DSHS, or not DSHS, but Social Security medical providers. So getting a comprehensive evaluation, you need to know that many of these individuals are paid directly by Social Security. And the amount of work they get depends on the amount of denials they can help produce, right? So there is a clear, if you're not aware of this now, be aware that there is a clear conflict of interest, which I don't know how that can exist, because for attorneys, we have very clear rules about conflicts of interest. There's a really clear conflict of interest between Social Security medical evaluators because you are being reviewed by someone whose job in some cases is rewarded for denying folks. So that's just something to be very careful about. The other thing we're seeing with Social Security, the medical evaluators, is that they are further and farther being scheduled outside of King County or out in King County. So making it very difficult for folks to be able to travel or gain access to these medical evaluators. And what Social Security is telling us is that there's less people available. So therefore, if you live in downtown Seattle, we need to send you to Kent, like deep Kent, right? Where it can take hours and hours to travel to, which is a huge barrier for many of our clients. So that's just some things to keep in mind. If you don't have a doctor that you can use, that if you're using their doctor, keep in mind that it isn't always the most unbiased or objective source of getting medical information. So that's why it's really important to try to help someone get access, if they're on Medicaid, get access to a doctor that can do that objectively without the whole idea of trying to go through Social Security. And I've also seen bias within the medical profession. That's Hannah talked a little bit about that from doctors. In fact, when I was in law school, I remember helping someone get their disability waiver for naturalization, and the doctor and was trying to get on Social Security, SSI, right? And the doctor straight up said, "Why would this person be deserving of Social Security? They haven't done anything." Right. And this was a refugee, right? And I was going to say something, but the interpreter went off and I had to break it up between the interpreter and the doctor. But that just gives you an example of just the type of bias that can be out there. And of course, after we got the doctor to sign off on the paperwork, I told the client, hey, maybe it's time to look for another doctor, right? Because you have a very biased doctor. And if there's additional things that you need from this doctor, he doesn't, outside of his medical opinions, he doesn't believe refugees are worth or deserving of benefits, which is a whole other thing, right? So it is out there. So being careful that when you're working with someone, a medical provider, that they may not be using objective medical lens, that they have not even an implicit bias, they're just straight up biased, right? Which is, I know doctors like that. So, and I've heard of doctors like that. So it's not unheard of or a limited thing, but it is something that's out there. And so trying to identify all those things with doctors, clinics, and where they've received information or medical records. So here, I'm not going to go over this, but these are things that you may need to get in terms of documents for the application. And don't worry if you can't get all these things right up front. You can always supplement these as part of your application. And there may be cases where the ALJ at the hearing may say, I need additional information, called a supplemental hearing. And so there may be, at the directive of the administrative law judge during the hearing, that judge may decide that they want additional information and want you to go get it to help them make a decision about disability. And so those are things that I think that if you can't get it right off the bat towards the application, don't worry. Just do your best to get any information that's missing to the process, keeping in mind that the ALJ may order additional things. Here you can see this is for SSI only. This is a portal for SSI, and that link should help you take you and your client there. And what happens is that once you submit it, SSA will schedule an appointment and they'll notify you by mail about the appointments. And if you don't get contacts or if you don't get anything or response from Social Security, I think at that point you may want to call them, which we'll talk about the pros and cons. This goes over phone applications. So you can call for both SSDI and SSI to apply over the phone. There are some that are in person, but those are limited exceptions. If you've ever been to the Social Security office, you know that can be a very drawn out and prolonged experience. And so making sure that you are helping that person through the phone, that can be kind of tricky also, because we have seen a lot of shenanigans with Social Security with the phone. So for example, there have been many occasions where the attorney and the client will be waiting for a call during a scheduled time, and then they won't get a call. And then they'll get a message automatically on voicemail saying you weren't there, therefore you were going to default you or whatever, or you missed your appointment. And they both were sitting there, but the phone never rang, right? So this is something that happens consistently. The other thing is that sometimes the representative will try to hide, so they won't give you their last name. They'll only give you the first name, and so there really isn't a way to try to look them up or get back to them. So that is something that we've seen them do in regards to the process. So be careful, because they can be very slippery in regards to getting a hold of, or willfully in some cases trying to hide the ball from you and your client. So that's something I think can be very tricky. But here you can see you want to determine and contact the local office. So it's all by zip code, a schedule, an appointment, support the client and information that's needed, and if necessary, allow them to use your phone number and telephone to complete the application interview. Here's a listing of the different zip codes and contact information in regards to which one would be your local office. So this is here in the slides, and you can take a look. And also a fax number. So Social Security still uses fax in this day and age of email and PDFs and all these other electronic types of ways to communicate. They still use a fax machine. So that seems to be one of the main ways to get a hold of them. So if you wanted to send a PDF or something like that, that's not usually something that can be done via email. It is either fax or in-person drop-off, which can be a little bit tricky too, but that list will have a lot of the information. So here we can see there's a portal online that you can apply for. So the pros and cons of the online portal with the follow-up, this is the third option, is that you can get a re-entry code. So that way, if you are not finished and you need to pause or exit, which totally be me, I would have to pause and exit and come back at a later time or date. You can get a re-entry code, but you need to make sure to write it down. And you don't have to wait for an appointment to have to interact with a Social Security rep to apply. The cons is that they may require that you create and log into your My SSA account. to fill out the application. And in some cases, the My SSA account is straightforward, but you may require an activation code from SSA in the mail or identification. I recently got my social security card because I had applied for this job a year ago, and I found it rather easy to set up a My SSA account. But again, it's all based on privilege. I have my own laptop, I have internet, I have mail that's pretty secure. And so based on my privilege background and the money that I have, I'm able to do it really easily and quickly. It may be a bit more difficult for folks with barriers and instability.
And Hui, I just want to do a quick time check. We're just about 15 minutes out, so.
Okay, I'll go through these really quickly.
Perfect.
Give me 1 second. So here is some medical information that you may want to be aware of in terms of records. Actually, I may have to fly through this pretty fast. Some of this was covered in January. So if you want more information about the medical information support, Hannah did a really thorough job of explaining that. And it was very similar to Social Security. But you can go back to that in January and take a look at that. But here we're looking at DDS. So that is the Division of Development or Disability Determination Services. And so those are representatives that look at the information, and they can request records, but they're not always thorough. They're not always the most accurate. So making sure that DDS gets everything. And in some cases, you may have to request some of the records on behalf of the clients. So looking at who and where the clinic was, and also the time frame and the date. So the dates are a very important factor. So if it's something that has been a chronic condition that's over a course of time, so those are things that you may want to think about in regards to the medical records. Here are some things that some support statements that I think Hannah's letter of support is very similar. And I think those are things that you want to elaborate on. Not only the fact that the person can't work, but what the nature of the disability is, and just how it connects, and the nexus between the disability and the inability to work. I'm going to skip over the application process because it can be very, very lengthy. But here we see these are the different levels. Like I said, about 70% of people are denied Social Security right from the get-go at the very number one application, right? And so there's reconsiderations, there's hearings that you can go to, there's an appeals council, and then there's a federal court level of appeal, which can be more elaborate. And the more that you go up towards the hearing itself. So here we can see these boxes. The purple is the initial application. The green is something called reconsideration. So you're asking them to reconsider your application, and that's just a paper review. Usually those aren't approved at a very high rate at all. You can see there it's very high rate of denial. But then at the orange level, that is the administrative hearing level, where a majority of the folks do get approved based on access to an attorney and based on medical records. But once you get to the appeals, the AC level, and then the federal level of appeal, right, an appeals court, so federal court appeal, those approvals drop dramatically, especially when you see at the federal court level 2%. So the main way that you're going to be eligible for benefits is probably going to be at the ALJ level. There was a question about ABD, whether you should reapply or continue to appeal, and it really depends on the case. And I think the downside of reapplying is that you may lose the retroactive benefits. We've had cases where people have waited up to 6 years to get their benefits, right, because of appeals, and they may negotiate to say, hey, we'll give you the benefit if you only take 2 years worth of back pay. And it is a painful conversation to have with your client because you're asking them to give up things, but that's something that is a reality, which is something that I think the client has to decide based on their circumstance, whether they want to settle with negotiations. Here's just some things that you could help your client through the application process. We're not going to go through it because I'm out of time. And here's additional documents, supporting materials. very, very similar to letters of support of ABD, so we're not going to go over that. Protective filing date is the date that you want to go back for back pay. So at the end of the day, if you're waiting 2 to 3 years in regards to your benefits, that's something that I think is really important to have that protective filing date. I'm going to skip over some of these slides because there seems to be a lot. Communicating with Social Security, the biggest thing is to understand that telephone, if you're going to call by telephone, it's going to be a several hour wait. So you're waiting several hours on the phone. So make sure that if you are trying to call through, that you have some time with the client to be on speakerphone to wait, because it is a very lengthy wait. The local office is going to be more responsive than the national phone line. So if you call the Social Security phone line, that's national, that's going to be a much more dramatic wait as opposed to calling the local office. The slides do have tips and tricks about if you're going to be calling versus visiting. If you're going to visit the office, be prepared for even longer waits. And anything that you send via fax or mail, make sure to get a receipt, because they are notorious for losing documents in a level that is almost incompetent when you look at DSHS, right? So it's not something, I mean, I joke about it with my clients where I say, hey, I'm going to fax this to Social Security, but I really believe they have their fax machine set over a garbage can, and it just goes straight in the garbage can. And it's a joke, but it's not a joke. It's actually something that a lot of our advocates experience, which is they are really, really good at losing things and not capturing things and not having things in the file. So making sure that if you do send something by mail, that you have it by certified mail. And then that if you send something by fax, that you make sure to keep your fax confirmations. I'm going to go over this. This last thing I'm going to cover is that currently under ABD, if you are getting ABD and then apply for SSI, once you get onto SSI, you will get a lump sum, especially if you've been waiting for several years. So all that money you will get is a lump sum. And currently ABD will make you repay that amount that you received in ABD benefits from your lump sum, which means you're getting significantly less money getting deducted from your Social Security. However, that will end in October 2025. This is a new rule that is in October 2025. If you get on SSI as of that date, you will not have to repay your ABD benefits. So that means more money for housing, more money for support with your medical issues. So you can spend it on medical equipment or medical technology or medical adaptations to your house. So those are all things that are going to change as of October 2025. And so I see I only have a very limited amount of time, so I could take some questions. We'll try to if we can't answer your question today, then we will get back to you. I think we've done this before where we reply back to you with the questions that we have. And that way I can send some questions out to the attorneys too, and they can get back to you.
Awesome. Thank you. I know that was a lot to cover in a short amount, but we've got a couple questions that have come through that I think we've got time to answer. So I'm just going to go back up to kind of the beginning of your presentation. So for SSI, how much will the benefit be for a person 65 years old who came to the States legally as a LPR and became a US citizen, but did not work in the States at all?
Yeah, so the question is that for SSI, it would be $914. There are, for SSDI, there are some rules about international work. It can be rather complicated, and that amount is going to be different from SSDI, because the SSDI is based on your work credits and work history, whereas SSI, if they didn't work in the US, that is not considered as part of the insurance program, and therefore you would get the flat rate of $914.
Great. Is the SGA limit per month or year?
Per month, and it's gross, so before any deductions. And like I said, they will split it in half in terms of what is applied to your benefit for reductions, and it's a dollar for dollar reduction after they split it in half. But I would not mess around with that amount. I would say I would have a wide berth between you and that amount in terms of the amount of income that you make, so that way you're avoiding any potential problems.
Great. If the household has more than one vehicle, is every vehicle counted as asset?
Yes, so this is called deeming. So it depends on the household and your relationship to that person, right? So if you're a spouse, that is someone that is considered to be a household. If you're a child, a minor child, that is something that you would be deemed to your household. So income deeming and resource deeming is a thing. However, if, for example, you're living with a roommate, there may be some in-kind types of deductions that would cause your benefit to be reduced if you're sharing or receiving housing. However, a roommate is not the same thing as a household in terms for definitions of Social Security. Therefore, that roommate's resources, their car, should not be counted towards yours. Although that can be very complicated and blurred as you share a lot of things like a bank account, which we tell people don't share bank accounts, which people do sometimes. And that can create problems with identifying who actually owns it. But if they're an adult child, if they aren't considered to be part of the household based on their legal obligations and relationships to other people in the household, that extra car would not count.
Awesome. In the settlement award scenario, can they keep their eligibility if they deposit into an ABLE account?
Generally, yes, depending on the amount of the settlement. And I believe I was looking at this last night at Washington Law Help. So if you're not familiar, WashingtonLawHelp.org. So it's just Washington, spell out Washington, lawhelp.org. They have a variety of self-help publications that many social workers, if you're not familiar with it, you can go to look at some of these questions. There is a publication on what to do if you receive a settlement. And I believe on that chart, it says who's eligible and how much. If in doubt, like I said, talk to a lawyer. So don't try to give it legal advice. But I do think that is something you could protect in an ABLE account as resources. But again, it has to be done by a certain time frame, certain process to make it a seamless transition to avoid any hiccups or breaks in coverage.
Great. And then our final question, do bank accounts that are located overseas are also taken into consideration for someone who has double nationality in regards to the income criteria?
Yes. So overseas bank account, I'd have to double check this, but my guess would be yes, because we've had cases where people were told that they have resources overseas and therefore they're terminated. And the main one is refugees who have resources like land or a home in their home country that they own. And Social Security will say that's a resource that is available to you when it's not, right? So many of these situations involve people who are refugees who are escaping because of fear of persecution or death, right? And they will tell them, you need to go back to your country to sell that when it's not safe for them to do so. In many cases, there is actual war or genocide going on, active genocide going on in that country where the person cannot return. And so that really requires a lawyer to argue that this resource is not available to you. So an overseas bank account, I would assume would be the same, which is even though they have dual nationality, that is a resource. If it's available to you and you can access it, then that is something you would argue that that is a resource. But for some reason, for a legal barrier that you can't access it, that's when you would argue at a hearing that it's not available to me, therefore it should not be counted as a resource. So that is something that would have to be dealt with in a hearing in front of a judge. And some judges are very sympathetic and some are not.
Thank you. Well, we are just about at time. We'll put in another really helpful tip in terms of when you drop stuff off at the Social Security Administration office to get a timestamp.
Yes.
In support of your emphasis on how adept they are at losing information and documents. Thank you, Hui, so much for being here. Brittany, Will, Hannah, who's already gone. This was amazing. Thank you all for your patience with our tech issues today. Appreciate you all hanging in here, being with us. This was wonderful. I will work to get this information out to you as soon as possible, and I will double check links for our future training. So thank you all. Have a lovely day. I have to run to another meeting, so I'm going to end this, but enjoy the sunshine and talk to you later. Bye-bye.